The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed sharp on the vast, unforgiving anvil of the high plains. It carried the scent of snow and the taste of iron, a promise of the brutal winter already clawing at the edges of autumn. Each step was a negotiation with exhaustion, her worn-out boots sinking into the crusted earth, the thin fabric of her dress offering no sanctuary from the cold that had settled deep in her bones. She was a ghost haunting a landscape that had no memory of her, because she had no past left to remember. It had been burned away, leaving only the flight, the fear, and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. Her gaze, raw and frantic, scanned the horizon. There was nothing, only the bruised purple of the twilight sky pressing down on an endless expanse of gray-brown grass that shivered in the gale. The town was days behind her now, its judgmental eyes and righteous whispers a fading echo, replaced by the more honest cruelty of nature. She stumbled, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop. A cry, thin and brittle, was torn from her throat and immediately devoured by the wind. She fell hard, the impact jarring through her frail body. "This is it," a quiet voice inside her stated, not with panic, but with a profound, desolate acceptance. This is the end of the running. Lying there, with the frozen ground leaching the last of her warmth, the world began to soften at the edges, the roar of the wind dissolving into a low hum. She thought of fire, not for its warmth, but for its bite. She could almost feel it, a phantom agony that lived beneath the layers of her clothing, a permanent testament to a faith she never truly had and a man who called it piety. A shadow fell over her. It was so sudden, so stark against the fading light, that for a moment she believed it was death itself, come to claim her. She forced her eyes open. A man stood there, tall and broad, a silhouette against the violent sky. He was as much a part of the harsh landscape as the gnarled junipers and the jagged rock formations. A heavy hide coat hung from his shoulders, and the rifle he held was not pointed at her, but carried with an ease that suggested it was an extension of his arm. His face was shadow and angles, a beard thick with frost, his eyes lost in the darkness beneath the brim of a stained hat. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. It was a primal instinct, honed by bitter experience. A man alone in a place like this was a predator, and she was, in every conceivable way, prey. She tried to scramble backward, to pull her injured leg under her, but the movement only sent a fresh wave of pain and nausea through her. He took a step closer, the crunch of his boots on the hard earth like the breaking of bones. She flinched, curling into herself, a hand instinctively flying to her back, to the source of her shame and her terror. He stopped. He did not speak. The silence stretched, broken only by the keening wind. He knelt, not close, but near enough that she could see the cold weathered lines around his eyes. They were a pale, clear gray, like a winter sky after a storm, and they held no discernible emotion. Not pity, not malice, not desire. Nothing. It was the nothing that terrified her most. After an eternity, he reached out, not for her, but for the worn leather satchel she clutched to her chest. She held it tighter. It was all she had. Inside was a half-loaf of stale bread and a small, smooth stone she'd carried since childhood. He did not pull, simply held his hand there, waiting. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she relinquished it. He took it, slung it over his own shoulder, and then, with a movement that was surprisingly gentle, he gathered her into his arms. The world tilted and went dark. She awoke to the scent of wood smoke and sage. For a long, disoriented moment, she lay perfectly still, listening. A fire crackled softly in a stone hearth, its light dancing across the rough-hewn timbers of a ceiling. She was on a cot, tucked beneath a thick wool blanket that smelled of horse and leather and cold, clean air. The pain in her ankle had been reduced to a dull, throbbing ache, the joint tightly bound in a clean strip of cloth. A small, one-room cabin, sparsely furnished, impeccably clean. A table with a single chair, shelves holding tins and jars, a rifle rack by the door. Her satchel rested on the floor beside the cot. Nothing had been taken. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, her head swimming. The man was at the hearth, his back to her, stirring something in a black iron pot. He moved with a quiet economy, a deliberateness that seemed to absorb all sound. He was a creature of silence. She watched him, her fear a live thing in her throat. Every kindness she had ever known had come with a price, a hook hidden beneath the bait. She had learned to see the hook first. He seemed to sense her gaze, turning his head slightly. "Stew's hot," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel, and used as sparingly as everything else in this place. He ladled the stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her, setting it on a small crate beside the cot. He did not try to help her sit up, did not hover. He simply placed the food and a spoon within her reach and retreated to the hearth, giving her space. The stew was thick with rabbit and root vegetables, and the first spoonful was so scaldingly, beautifully hot it brought tears to her eyes. She ate with the ravenous desperation of a starving animal, not daring to look at him, acutely aware of his presence across the room. Days bled into one another in this silent rhythm. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and left for the day. He would leave food for her, a piece of bread, a bowl of leftover stew, and fresh water in a bucket. He never spoke unless necessary. More would, storms coming. The bandage needs changing. That was the moment she dreaded. Her back was a map of her own private hell, a latticework of old silvery scars, exquisitely detailed and horrifyingly intimate. They were shaped like scripture, the letters of a cruel verse branded into her skin by Preacher Thorne's holy iron. She had done everything to keep it hidden, washing and dressing herself in the brief moments he was gone, her movements stiff with pain and fear. But a fever had taken hold one night, born of her infected ankle, and she had woken from a night of delirious nightmares to find him kneeling beside her, a damp cloth in his hand. Her dress, soaked with sweat, had clung to her, and the thin fabric had become translucent over her shoulder blades. He had been wiping her brow, but he froze. She saw it in the sudden stillness of his posture. His gaze had dropped to her back. She felt it like a physical touch, a searing heat that had nothing to do with the fever. Her breath caught in her chest. This was it, the moment of revulsion, the moment the questions would begin, or the judgment, or the turning away. She waited for him to speak, to recoil in disgust. But he did nothing. His gray eyes, when they eventually lifted to meet hers, were unreadable, but the stillness in them had changed. It was no longer placid. It was the stillness of a deep, cold lake beneath which something powerful stirred. He finished wiping her forehead, his touch as steady as before. Then he rose, adjusted her blanket to cover her completely, and turned back to the fire. He never mentioned it. He never asked. But from that moment on, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer a void between two strangers. It was a shared space, weighted with an unspoken knowledge. He began leaving a small jar of a pungent, soothing salve next to her water bucket. He never indicated what it was for, but she knew. Each night, in the flickering privacy of the firelight, after he had settled into his own bedroll across the room, she would apply the cool balm to the scarred, tight skin of her back. And in that quiet, solitary ritual, a seed of trust, fragile and tentative, began to take root in the scorched earth of her soul. The arrival of the horses was a sound that did not belong. It cut through the familiar peace of the afternoon, the whisper of the wind in the pines, the distant caw of a raven. Alara was outside, her ankle now strong enough for short walks, gathering fallen branches for the fire. She froze, her hand gripping a piece of pine, the sticky resin clinging to her skin. 3 riders, black shapes cresting the ridge to the east, the direction of the town she had fled. Her heart seized, a cold fist of dread closing around it. She knew who they were before they were close enough to see their faces. It was Preacher Thorne and 2 of his deacons, the men who had held her down. She dropped the wood and scrambled back toward the cabin, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Silas was inside, cleaning his rifle, the parts laid out on an oilcloth. He looked up as she burst through the door, his eyes immediately registering the raw terror on her face. 3 riders, she gasped, pointing eastward. From the town, he didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. He simply rose, his movements fluid and unhurried, and began to reassemble the rifle with practiced efficiency. The metallic clicks were the only sounds in the room, each one a sharp, definitive punctuation mark in the suffocating silence. He was calm. His calmness was a strange anchor in the storm of her panic. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide, her body trembling. The old fear, the familiar helplessness, threatened to swallow her whole. But then she looked at him, at the set of his jaw, at the absolute focus in his hands. He was not afraid, and in his lack of fear, she found a sliver of her own. The riders reined in their horses a few dozen yards from the cabin door, their arrogance a palpable force. Preacher Thorn, a stout man with a face flushed with self-righteousness, dismounted. "We know she is in there, sinner," he bellowed, his voice accustomed to filling a church with fire and brimstone. "Send out the harlot. She must face the community's judgment for her wickedness." Silas finished his work. He slid a cartridge into the chamber, the sound loud and final. He looked at Alara, a single steady look. He didn't tell her to hide. He didn't tell her what to do. The choice was hers. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She had been running for so long. She was done. Straightening her shoulders, she walked to the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cold sunlight. She stood on the small porch, blinking against the glare, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she did not cower. Thorn's eyes, small and cruel, fixed on her. A triumphant, predatory smile spread across his face. There she is, the lost sheep, strayed from the flock. Silas stepped out behind her, the rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He stood slightly to her side, a silent, unmovable presence. Thorn's smile faltered as he took in the man before him. He had surely heard tales of the reclusive wolfer who lived in these hills, a man who kept to himself and was best left alone. "This is church business, friend," Thorn said, his tone attempting authority. "It does not concern you. Give us the woman. She is a vessel of sin, marked by her own corruption." "She's marked by you," Silas said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried across the clearing with more weight than Thorn's hollering. It was a statement of fact, cold and hard as granite. Thorn sputtered, his face purpling. "That mark is a sign from God, a warning to all who would." He was cut off by the sudden, deafening crack of the rifle. Alara flinched, but Silas hadn't moved. The tin cup hanging from the saddle of one of the deacons flew through the air, a neat hole punched through its center. The horse shied violently, its rider cursing as he fought for control. Silence descended, ringing and absolute. "She's not going with you," Silas stated into that silence. "This is her home now. You cannot keep her." Thorn blustered, though his bravado was gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat. "We will bring the sheriff. We will bring the whole town." Silas took a slow step forward. He wasn't aiming the rifle, but its presence was a promise. "You do that," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something that scraped along the bone. "And when you come back, you tell the sheriff to look for your branding iron. The one with the broken serif on the letter T. I imagine I'll have found a new use for it." He looked from Thorn to the other 2 men, his gaze lingering on them, cold and appraising. It was a look that stripped them bare, that saw every bit of their craven cruelty. They shifted in their saddles, their eyes darting from Silas to their preacher, their loyalty dissolving in the face of this calm, absolute threat. The preacher, for all his bluster, was a coward. He saw no fear in Silas, no hesitation, only a promise of a pain he himself was accustomed to dealing out, but not receiving. Without another word, he turned, scrambled back onto his horse, and spurred it into a gallop, his deacons close behind. They did not look back. The dust settled. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the vast silence of the plains. Alara stood on the porch, the trembling in her limbs slowly subsiding, replaced by a feeling she hadn't known in years. Stillness. Not the frozen stillness of fear, but the quiet, rooted stillness of safety. Silas ejected the spent cartridge, the brass casing glinting as it spun to the ground. He didn't look at her, but she felt his gaze all the same. The air between them was charged, a new understanding forged in the crucible of the confrontation. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The quiet of the cabin was no longer tense or tentative. It was a comfortable, shared peace. Days later, Silas returned from a rare trip to the nearest trading post, a journey he made only a few times a year. He laid his supplies on the table: flour, salt, coffee beans. Beneath them was a folded, week-old copy of the Platte Valley Chronicle. He said nothing, just pushed it toward her as he put the supplies away. Alara unfolded it. There, on the third page, was a small article with a stark headline: Preacher Accused, Fleas County. The story was brief, detailing how Preacher Thorne had been publicly accused by an unnamed source of brutality and abuse of his position, presenting evidence so damning the sheriff had been forced to act. Thorne, it said, had vanished before he could be arrested, his congregation left in disarray. She read the words twice, her fingers tracing the headline. It wasn't a story of heroes or gunfights. It was a quiet, clinical report, yet it was the loudest declaration of her freedom she could imagine. He had not just protected her. He had given her justice, not with a bullet, but with a truth spoken in the right place at the right time. She looked up at him. He was watching her, his expression as placid as ever, yet she could see the question in his eyes. Without a word, she folded the newspaper neatly, walked to the hearth, and laid it gently on the glowing embers. They watched together as the paper blackened, curled, and dissolved into flame. The headline, the preacher's name, the story of her past. All of it turned to ash and smoke, rising up the chimney and disappearing into the wide starlit sky. A weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying lifted from her shoulders. The scars on her back remained, a permanent part of her history, but they no longer felt like a brand of shame. They were simply a testament to a fire she had walked through, a story of survival. She turned from the hearth and looked at the man who had offered her sanctuary without condition, who had seen her deepest wound and had not flinched, but had quietly set about helping her heal. He stood by the table, a solid, steadfast presence in the warm light of the cabin. She was no longer a ghost, running from the past. She was a woman standing in her home, looking toward a future that was as vast and open as the landscape outside her door, a landscape she would no longer have to face alone.